Hi, I'm Breanna Zinky, and I'll be presenting on the Cherokee court cases. Who were the Cherokee? So, the Cherokees were one of the many confederations of Native Americans formed to bring order to the local region and unite their towns and alliances. They have always resided in present-day Georgia mainly. When the Cherokee began to become greatly outnumbered by American settlers, and they had a great decline in power, many of them followed the federal policy of promoting civilization. Some established businesses, some became slave-owning farmers. Other nativists were angered by this, however, as they wanted to get rid of European influences and continue resisting white influence on their land. Many white Americans viewed the Cherokees as a civilized tribe because of their written language and constitution that the Cherokees made in an attempt to become Republican citizens. And the Cherokees were the first group of Native Americans to press their legal rights all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. This picture just illustrates where the Cherokee territory mainly was, and mainly for this presentation we're focusing on their population at the top of Georgia here. Years before the court cases, when the War of Independence ended, Congress took the position that by helping the British, Native Americans had forfeited the right to their lands. Peace conferences were then held in which American representatives demanded large surrenders of Indian land, and then treaties followed with the Cherokee and a few other tribes. The picture on the right illustrates one treaty that was held between the Cherokee. Congress did guarantee the permanency of the Indians' remaining reduced land within these treaties, but this promise was not followed through later on. And with the addition of large parts of land throughout other treaties after the War of Independence, policymakers had to decide how to deal with Native American tribes residing on that land. In the 1820s, the answer that policymakers came to the question of how to deal with the Native Americans became forced removal and resettlement to the west. Americans wanted to expand, and some states had already started forcing the Indian populations to leave their state. This was especially practiced in slave states, as they wanted to extend the area of slavery and convert Indian soil into slave soil. As part of Andrew Jackson's campaign, the Indian Removal Act of 1830 was passed. This act provided funds, $500,000, to uproot the 5 civilized tribes, of which the Cherokee was a part of, and move them west. Because of this law, many groups of Native Americans were losing their land. And the picture on the right shows many routes these Native Americans had to take when being relocated, and the blue is the Cherokee. As I stated earlier, the Cherokee Nation had already taken great efforts to become Republican citizens. They established schools, adopted written laws, and even had a constitution modeled on that of the United States. Some even became successful farmers and owned slaves. Despite this, they were still labeled as savages by President Andrew Jackson, and Andrew Jackson supported Georgia's effort to take away Cherokee land and nullify their laws. Citizens of the Cherokee Nation decided to petition Congress for aid in remaining in peace upon their territory, and they stated freedom meant them keeping their lands. The Cherokee leaders even followed typical American practice and went to court to protect their rights because of the removal in laws that were being carried out against them. Their appeals forced the Supreme Court to clarify the status of Native Americans. Another very important preceding case to the Cherokee cases is the case of George Tassel. In 1830, George Tassel, a Cherokee Native American, was illegally tried, convicted, and executed for murder. He had allegedly killed another Cherokee man within Cherokee territory. This case became the first legal document to support Cherokee sovereignty. Since the Cherokee Nation was considered sovereign by U.S. law, Tassel should have been tried in a Cherokee court. Instead, the trial went through the Georgia Supreme Court. The Cherokee chief, John Ross, requested to appeal Tassel's case at the National Supreme Court after he was first found guilty through the Georgia Supreme Court. The Supreme Court accepted the appeal and ordered records of the trial from the state and for the governor of Georgia to appear before them. And the picture is just an example of one of the documents from the Cherokee that served as a petition against the state of Georgia. The governor of Georgia responded by the order to appear at the Supreme Court by then calling an emergency session of the state's General Assembly. In this session, laws were enacted that nullified any contracts between whites and the Cherokees. required Cherokees to take a pledge of loyalty to the state of Georgia, and white employees of the Cherokee had to have a permit from the state to work for them. The governor also encouraged the Georgia judge, who was originally in charge of Tassel's case, to refuse the Supreme Court's demand for trial records and proceed to execute George Tassel anyways. After this case, Georgia started enforcing emergency session laws, which led to the imprisonment of Samuel Worcester, leading to the case of Worcester v. Georgia later on. And the picture shows examples of some of the laws passed by Georgia that restricted the Cherokee. One of them, for example, at the start, says that no non-English speaking Cherokee could testify in court. In 1828, the state of Georgia passed a series of laws that stripped the Cherokees of their right. Some of these laws include outlawing meetings of the Cherokee legislature and annexing part of their territory into Georgia counties. These laws also authorized Cherokee removal from lands that the state wanted. Georgia even started advertising a statewide lottery giving away Cherokee land, and the picture on the side illustrates one of those land lotteries. In defense against this, the Cherokee cited treaties they had negotiated as an independent nation with the United States. These treaties guaranteed the Cherokee both land and independence. These negotiations, bringing up these treaties to President Jackson and Congress, failed. Under the leadership of John Ross, the Cherokee resorted to requesting from the Supreme Court an injunction or order to stop against Georgia to prevent those laws from being carried out. The court sympathized with the Cherokees' plight, and the Chief Justice, John Marshall, acknowledged them, but he stated the court could not base its analysis on sympathy. He also concluded that before the case could be considered, the court had to determine whether it even had the jurisdiction to hear it. The Cherokee argued that they were a foreign state. They supported this claim by stating that the tribe was a distinct political society that managed its own affairs, and that the U.S. government had regarded them as a state. They also gave evidence that the federal government negotiated treaties with them, also proving that they were regarded as a foreign state by the government. And this picture just illustrates the case of the Cherokee Nation against the state of Georgia. The court ended up rejecting the claims of the Cherokee that they were a foreign nation. Marshall stated that they were not a foreign state as meant by the Constitution because they were located geographically inside the borders of the United States. The Cherokees could sometimes be seen as an independent nation, but were also dependent on the nation that surrounded them. The court also used the point that the Cherokee acknowledged, in the treaties they signed, that they were under the protection of the United States. Another source that was used by the courts to justify classifying the Cherokee as separate from a foreign nation was the Commerce Clause. As stated directly in the Constitution, the Commerce Clause empowers Congress to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. The clause distinguished between foreign nations and Indian tribes, so it was another way to prove they were separate classifications. Because of this, the court classified the Cherokee as an Indian nation. The Constitution only authorizes the court to hear cases from foreign nations and not Indian nations, so the court dismissed the case, ruling that they were not authorized to hear it. As a result, Georgia's laws that were passed over the Cherokee were not stopped. After the Cherokee Nation versus Georgia case, Georgia passed another law requiring white citizens to obtain a state license before living inside Cherokee territory. A group of missionaries there, including Samuel Worcester, refused to obtain this license. These missionaries supported the Cherokees' resistance to Georgia's removal efforts. Worcester and 6 others were indicted and charged by a Georgia court. They were brought to trial and then convicted, and they were all sentenced to 4 years in prison. Worcester appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court by claiming that the Georgia court lacked the authority to convict them. He stated that Georgia had no legal power over sovereign Cherokee territory. Worcester argued that the Indian Commerce Clause in the Constitution is the main source of federal power over tribes. He stated that the clause meant that the federal government had exclusive jurisdiction over interactions with Native Americans. Worcester also supported his point with the treaties that were made between the United States and the Cherokee Nation, which could not be interfered with by the state. Chief Justice Marshall agreed with some of Worcester's points and reviewed many of the treaties. He found evidence, through a series of laws passed by Congress that regulated trade with tribes, that Native American communities were regarded as separate nations from the time of early colonial America. He also found that two of the treaties in particular clearly recognized the Cherokees' right of self-government and guaranteed them their land. Marshall decided that it was the federal government's duty to protect that agreement. This resulted in the meaning that only the United States federal government can negotiate the terms of Native American lands and their use, and that the states lack the constitutional power to deal with them at all. When reviewing the case, the Supreme Court ruled that because the Cherokee Nation was a separate political identity that couldn't be regulated by the state, Georgia's license law was unconstitutional. This meant that Georgia could not pass the license law, and that Worcester's conviction for violating that law should be overturned. The decisions involving the Cherokee established the basic principles of Native American sovereignty. It established that this sovereignty could be diminished by the United States federal government, but not by the states individually. It also created a responsibility for the United States to look after the best interest of the Native Americans. And the picture on the right was a newspaper created by the Cherokee, the first Native American newspaper. Samuel Worcester actually contributed many articles to the newspaper, and many articles had to do with the cases and relating laws. After the ruling was made for the Worcester v. Georgia case, President Andrew Jackson refused to recognize the validity of the case. He stated, "John Marshall had made his decision, now let him enforce it." As a result, the ruling was not followed by the state of Georgia or enforced by the government. The missionaries remained imprisoned for another year until a new Georgia governor negotiated for their release. Despite the Cherokee's legal victory, because President Andrew Jackson refused to recognize the Supreme Court's ruling, removal of Native American tribes and the efforts from Georgia to remove them continued. With legal appeals exhausted, one faction of the Cherokee Nation agreed to cede their land. In 1835, this faction of the Cherokee signed the Treaty of New Echota, giving up all their land east of the Mississippi River for $5 million. The majority of the Cherokees, however, led by John Ross, who was elected principal chief under the Cherokee Constitution, opposed this treaty and still passively resisted. And the map on the right just illustrates the area of land specified in the Treaty of New Echota. In 1838, federal forces forcibly removed the rest of the Cherokee. The army herded 18,000 of them into stockades and forced them to move west, leading to what is called the Trail of Tears. In the Trail of Tears, at least 1/4 of them perished. The Trail of Tears was the removal route from Georgia to present-day Oklahoma. And the picture on the top here just is an illustration of the Trail of Tears, and you can see it shows many of them suffering and a few dying. And the bottom right picture shows the route from Georgia to the Indian Territory and Oklahoma that they were relocated to. Despite the many efforts from Native Americans, especially the Cherokee legal efforts, removal was not able to be stopped, and many Native American tribes lost their land and suffered greatly. Today, the ruling in Worcester v. Georgia is no longer binding. The Supreme Court holds that, to a certain extent, a state may regulate Indian territory within its boundaries. Both Cherokee cases did have great influence on future law cases, especially those relating to Native Americans. Here are the references I used. I used 4 JSTOR sources, 3 of which were academic journals and 1 of which was a book. The other sources I used were also educational academic sources, including the textbook, that were trustworthy.